Alrighty, very happy to be welcoming Richard Hines today on the podcast. We're going to be talking about data governance today, including, a boot camp you're going to be teaching for us at TDWI. But Richard, of course, is an analytics consultant and educator and has worked with us here at TDWI for quite some time. Richard, thank you so much for joining today. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thank you, Andrew. And good morning, everybody. Welcome to this session.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Richard, before I get into the questions kind of around data governance here, I was hoping maybe you could share a brief background about yourself so that we can get to know you a little bit better and your expertise as well.
Sure. So I've been working in the data and analytics space for 25 years now. Held all kinds of different roles. I built up a analytics company and sold that, stayed on as a global VP for one of the larger SI implementers of data and analytics. I've been in industry, love being in industry because you take a long-term view versus a consulting view, which was the majority of my career. But in industry, I've been head of data and AI for a very large oil and gas company, and then also an airline company, and now back into the energy space where I hold a senior leadership role with an energy company now.
Well, that's amazing. And I'm sure given all of that time and different areas that you've been able to cover, you've seen a lot change here, which kind of bleeds into my first question. I'm going to get started here with some of these data governance topics that we want to discuss. So, as I alluded, a lot has changed. I'm sure you've seen a lot change in the world of data and with artificial intelligence as well. So, how important is data governance at this time, given what's changed in the last 10 years or so?
I'd say that data governance is more important than it ever has been. One of the challenges that we had in the early days of this data and analytics work is some companies were really bought into the value of the work. And other companies were struggling with the value and they just focused on reporting and kind of basic things. So when you're talking about data governance, the fundamental issue in the early days was that people weren't totally bought in on the value of this. So fast forward to 2023, people have had a great deal of success in many different industries, manufacturing and energy industry, for any kind of resource-based industry, as well as retail and traditional technology industries where this is quite prevalent. But people don't doubt the value of the data anymore, right? And as a result, people wanted to take advantage, companies want to take advantage of the opportunities that are there in the value of the data. So you hear people talking about data monetization. I hear people talking about data privacy, and these are not, conversations that happen between a handful of North American experts anymore, right? These are conversations that happen in every company. So we're at this point where it's like, okay, well, there's a massive amount of value out there. So how does data governance, what role does data governance play in helping us with achieving this value? And the way I think about that is it helps us in two ways. These data governance techniques help us from a defensive perspective and also from an offensive perspective. And when we talk about data governance and the techniques and processes and so on that it brings forward in order for it to help us from a defensive perspective, what we're focused on there is how it helps keep companies' data safe, right? And us as consumers, where we give our data to, say, our financial institutions and retail institutions, we want to feel safe. We want to feel like our data is safe. This whole defensive posture on data has blown up over the last number of years. In the US, I think there are over 80 pieces of regulation regarding privacy and protection of data. So the public cares a lot about this. The government cares a lot about this. So this defensive posture on data is an important space for organizations to be really good at. And it's difficult to be good at if you're not good at data governance, because it's those techniques and roles and responsibilities and that really come to bear that help us be good at the defensive posture of data. Now I'll talk a little bit about my favorite space, which is the offensive posture of data. So what is the offensive side of data? Well, the offensive side is data monetization. And when we think about that, we can think about data helping us keep costs down, create some automation to drive some simplicity, or drive revenue up, right? So those two things become really important if we're going to achieve a lot of the success that people are having with data, right? And you think of opportunities with predictions and opportunities with optimization and simulation. These are significant opportunities that are driving big value impact, big dollar impact on organizations all over the world. So how does data governance help us with that side of the portfolio, the offensive side of the portfolio? Well, essentially, if you want to achieve the offensive side of that portfolio, you have to have a very strong data asset for an organization. And when we think about something being an asset, there's certain things about it that need to be true, and we'll look to physical assets. So me with an airline background, when I think about planes, everybody knows that we need a plane to be available for people to be able to take advantage of. We need that plane to be safe. We need that plane to be operating at a very high level of quality if we're going to get the value out of that plane. So when we think about a data asset, we have the same expectations. If that data asset is not operating at a high level of value, right, a high level of quality, sorry, then you will not get the value of it. And everybody who has doing this type of work to try to get value from data, prediction, simulation, optimization, for example, they have problems with their data. There are absolute issues there. There's data quality issues all over the place. And data governance brings the techniques and methods for you to address those issues. Sometimes those issues you can knock down pretty quick and you get a nice quality uplift on the asset pretty quickly. Some of those issues, the root cause of those issues take a long time actually to improve. So the data governance is the governing body and governing processes that help us have a high quality data asset. Without a high quality data asset, you will be impaired as you try to get value from data monetization, and leveraging machine learning and more advanced techniques on data. Non-quality asset equals less quality benefits from that data source. So we have data governance really comes in from an offensive perspective, and it helps us make money from data.
Well, and that becomes very much top of mind. I think, especially in the last couple of years, we've seen data monetization really start to get more traction, and the thinking about that has seemed to evolve more quickly in the last few months. Even we did a best practices report here on data monetization at TDWI, authored by James Kabelis, and that was very interesting learning about that. So, given how things have changed, and you may have already touched on this a little bit, so if you did, I apologize. Maybe you can expand. The scope seemed to have changed potentially with data governance. Is there anything that might be new or additive underneath the umbrella of data governance now?
Yeah, there's all kinds of things that are new. You know, when I think about 20 years ago and data governance efforts that were put into place, or that tended to be hierarchical, they tend to be data governance oriented, which works in some industries and doesn't work in other ones. But that whole approach was really looking at structured data within a company's data center and environment, right? So you come forward into 2010 and 2012, as we started to leverage big data, all of a sudden the data that we're governing has blown up, and it's blown up in a manner I think that people weren't quite expecting. So you have a lot more data to govern and a lot more varieties of data. You know, in the past, I've had to govern audio data sets from call center conversations, for instance, right? How do you govern that? How do you maintain the privacy of people and what is said, but take advantage of it to try to get some benefits and some efficiencies in the call center. So you have these big data has definitely put a wrench in the plans, and I think that there was a notion at first in the data governance space, we'll just have to govern it all, and then I think that people realize that in many cases you cannot, right? It's just too much. So there's been puts and takes in the big data space. Another major thing that has come along is people don't always own their applications anymore. So in the early days, you could walk to a server room and you could touch the server and say, that's where my application is. And if I need to change it, I'll work with the vendor and I'll change it. But now with software as a service, you're basically outsourcing your app, right? So you think of companies like Workday and Salesforce, and there's many of them out there. More companies are moving to that model. So that has a big impact on data governance because you're no longer discussing these things internally. You're building contractual terms with a third party. What data are you going to receive from the software as a service application? How often are you going to receive it? Of what quality is your expectation of that data that you're receiving, right? So all of a sudden, it's more contractual terms with a third party rather than things that you're negotiating internally. And sometimes changes to an application that you need to improve quality are very hard to get done by software as a service, because they'll say, well, if I change it for you, I got to change it for everybody. And, you get into a bigger conversation like that. So software as a service is another big major change for the data governance arena, and in how we approach problems and how we solve problems and how long it takes to solve a problem. And then we have IoT data. So IoT data is another massive part of big data, data sets. But we have more and more of this sensor data. And I've worked with sensors for many, many years, going back to the mid 2000s. And there's all kinds of challenges there with them, failing and throwing junk and, so there's a lot of quality issues with IoT data, in addition to the volume. And when we talk about quality issues, some of these IoT solutions are good at having thresholds like permissible values, bottom and top threshold. Some of them aren't. They'll just fire whatever it's going to fire. So we got another big challenge for data governance to think about there, on the whole, how the world has changed over the last 25 years. Now data governance needs to adapt. Those are three big changes in technology. On the, when I think about how vendors have reacted, there's a couple of cool things that come along. We have business glossary, data dictionary, technology vendors that we didn't have back then. David Marco wrote a book in, I think, 2004 about the metadata repository, but that was all custom built. Now we have application vendors coming into that space to help. We have lots of ways to do data curation, from fabrics to lake houses to traditional data warehouses. All of that is helping, with having more flexibility, virtualization, have some flexibility on how we curate or organize data for companies to get value from it. So that's another positive thing on the technology side. And then lastly, I think the data marketplace is another big opportunity for organizations to share data in a much more sane way than they're sharing in the past. But all this, all of these things, whether I talk about the changes in technology that are driving, complexity for data governance, and have changes in technology that are making things a little easier for data governance, these all come together, and you try to balance it all out and make sure that your data governance program is being as effective as it can be and driving as much value as it can drive.
Well, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And obviously a lot, it goes into those different things, even though the technologies may make it somewhat easier. So it's a very valid point that you just made there. It always seems like if there's new technologies that are coming out to make things easier, there might be something else that's making it more complex. So going back historically, we've seen that there's been a lot of failures with data governance. And, given what you just explained, I'm imagining that might still be the case. Is it?
Yep. Especially given the size of the programs now. So you have, your offensive side, your defensive side. Some companies will only do defensive data governance, right? They'll just focus on keep the company safe, keep your CEO out of the news, talking about how do you have customer breach. And because it is large enough that you say, that's all I can do. And then all of the data science teams are kind of left to their own devices on the data asset, data quality side. Maybe that's appropriate for some companies, maybe it's not. I tend to focus a lot depending on industry, on the offensive side, because the demonetization opportunities are huge there. But the failures, yeah, so I teach data governance, and I have been teaching it since 2009, and I've taught it all over the world on 4 continents.
Wow.
And you get a view on it from different perspectives. And why is it that people fail at this so much? And if I would describe what I think of the biggest challenge with it is because it's vast, data governance and has become more vast over the last 10 years. People try to focus on things like roles and responsibilities. They say, how do I set up to be a governing body for this big, massive thing that's going on in my company? So when I'm in a classroom, people will always talk about roles and responsibilities, especially at the beginning of the class when I'm saying, hey, like, what do you want to know, right? Roles and responsibilities is huge. But I think the thing that you need to do is get focused on where your problems are and list out your problems that the company is experiencing with data, right? So a problem could be, for instance, on the defensive side, hey, we had a cyber breach 2 years ago, or the CEOs in the board are worried about a cyber breach. That's a problem for the company, right? And another problem could be our predictions are not delivering the value that we thought they would deliver. And a part of that is the quality of the input that is coming into the prediction. So that's another problem. And if you were to run a workshop and say, hey, what kind of problems are we experiencing in our company with data? Then you decide on which 2 problems you will go after. Depending on size of your team and budget, you can go after 3 problems, you go after 5, like who knows, it depends on how well you're sponsored. But it gets you focused. And then your program is not focused on the breadth of everything and how do I set up roles and responsibilities to achieve nothing within it, but instead it's focused on, listen, the breadth of this thing is huge. The company's got probably 100 problems with data, maybe 500 if you're a big company. Yeah, but we can do 3. And we're just going to go fix 3 problems, right? And we're going to use data governance as an enabler to fix those 3 problems or 10 problems, whatever the number is. And then you have a sense of success and you go, okay, we know now that data governance is not about roles and responsibilities. That is simply a component that helps us solve problems. We need to understand what the biggest problems are. And we need to go solve them. Data governance is our enabler to do that. So I think that a lot of the failures when I'm listening to people, from different parts of the world and where they're doing well and not doing well with data governance, I would say it comes down to focus. It comes down to this notion of the thing's so big that people get focused on the whole thing rather than getting focused on, what you can do. How can you impact an organization? You can't impact everything all at once. So focus on the biggest problems, knock them down, and then grab some more problems and knock them down. And then as you get some experience with that, first of all, you get some confidence in your data governance program. But secondly, it'll start to change how you see things, right? And how people see the value of the data governance process programs. When you start getting into these problems, you'll get into things like, well, the business process is wrong, right? The application that captures business process only captures half of it. Like the application's not good enough. Like you get into some big problems sometimes that are root cause for the data problems. But it's really where you got to go. You have to go to where the tension is in the company. You got to get focused on very specific problem and solve those ones and move on to the next one.
Yeah, I think the don't boil the ocean is something that we hear quite a bit when it comes to whatever data and analytics initiatives that you're getting started. But I think it's a very apt thing to mention. You really want to focus on the things that you can impact and change, to your point there. So I was going to ask you about what advice you might give to companies that are failing, but I think you just prescribed that. So I'm going to move into what if a company is just getting started, potentially with this data governance initiatives? What would be any advice that you would recommend to a brand new company there?
Yeah, probably the advice is the same for people who are already going and then companies that are new. One important point is you have to establish a common language on how you speak about this thing, data governance. So it is worthwhile doing some sort of training where you bring together, like I've done training with, say, 35 people in a room, because they all need to understand how we're going to solve data quality problems, right? And in that, what happens in that session is everybody gets the same understanding of it. It's really hard to do this with not a common semantical model on how you're just going to talk about these things. For instance, you talk about data stewardship, and people are like, well, what does that mean, right? And then you have to tell people, but you're telling people 3 at a time, in your company. It impacts, like, literally, I would say in my data governance program, we have about 1,000 people engaged. And if we're going to be dripping this notion of data governance to people a little bit at a time, and expecting people to understand the language that the experts have, I have a bunch of experts in data governance, and it's really difficult. So establishing a common semantical model or a common language for the company to be speaking about this is really important. And then secondly, what I just described in detail on start with problems, right? So find out where the biggest issues are. You can run some workshops with different groups, right? So you might go into marketing, you might go into operations and say, what's the biggest problems that you have with data? And then what are the impact of these problems? I've done workshops like that in the past quite a bit, and all of a sudden you start ranking them, like, what's the value if I solve this problem, and then what's the feasibility, how hard is it actually to solve it? And you go, okay, we got 10 problems that are pretty big problems that we think we can solve within 1 to 6 months, which is not too bad a period of time, and there's a lot of value there, so let's go do those ones, right? Those are the big opportunities, I think, for companies. A common language, and then get problem oriented and get a reputation as a data governance organization that solves problems.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense there. I do want to mention that for those that might be interested after listening to this, there is an opportunity to be in a classroom with you here at TDWI Orlando coming up in November, taking place November 5th through 10th. So Richard, I'd love for you to maybe, if you could, highlight a few things about what that data governance bootcamp might cover.
Sure. So the data governance bootcamp is oriented for people who are new, as well as people who have been doing this for 20 years. And often in that classroom, we have both. We have companies that are just getting going, and then companies that have 2 failures, right, or under the belt, or potentially more. So the cool thing about it is there's a lot of experience in the room, right? Mm-hmm. And I love that because, I love getting the class engaged and involved, and sharing their experience. When you go to a conference, you learn a lot from the people around you. So I'll be engaging the different levels of experience in the room to have conversations about what they think about some of the things that we're going to discuss. The courses themselves, we have a data quality course, which is a very pragmatic view on how you solve data quality problems, right? So I hope that when people are done that course, they're able to go back to their company and say, okay, let's take a data quality problem and go solve it. I usually show a lot of things that I do internally, not some tricks that I've been using over the last number of years, to help with data quality issues, because I do think there's simple ways to solve data quality problems rather than think it's a problem that you just can't solve in a short period of time. I don't believe that's true in all instances, although certainly in some. Other part of the course will be around data governance. And so what that course does is it's the developing that common language on how we're going to speak about this. And that course is very well traveled, and very well received for that benefit, establishing this common language. If I talk to any of the major SIs out there, right, the global SIs, they all have their little take on data governance, but it's not necessarily from an academic perspective of people who've been doing this for 30 years. So, which is what TDWI brings to the table. So that gives you a little bit of insight into the courses that you experience in the data governance bootcamp, as well as, I guess, my style in trying to engage the class in a good conversation around what works, right? And what is pragmatic, and how do you win?
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. I think the peer-to-peer type of relationships and explanations and understandings of what others are going through is probably quite valuable as well. Okay, well, Richard, I am going to let you go at this point. I really appreciate you stopping by and giving us a snapshot of the data governance programs that are out there and of the course that you're going to be teaching at TDWI Orlando. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Adrian. Have a great day.
You as well.